Hi, I'm Mike Henry, and this is my Procreate 4.3 demo for the piece I call Seafoam Dress. As you can see, I'm continuing my theme of not coming up with interesting titles for things, but I figure plain is best, because if I start putting crazy titles on things, it starts getting extra pretentious. So anyways, what you see here is the beginning of me just kind of messing around. I was watching a movie with my son. He was drawing, I was drawing, and we were trying to figure out what either of us were going to draw. And so I just started doodling, and then I decided to do some symmetry stuff just because that's always kind of fun to do, to try to figure out something interesting using a tool, basically. I actually started this right after doing the plaid slacks piece from a bit ago, and so I just wanted to continue doing like something kind of fashiony, but in the symmetry thing. So it really had no direction other than, okay, I'm drawing this woman, I'm getting her anatomy laid down, but I have no idea exactly where this is going to end up going. Sometimes just doodling like this, in the middle of it, you'll come up with an idea that feels extra special, so you do something really interesting with it. And other times you just sort of execute on a character or a figure just standing there. And so that's kind of what happened here. As you can see, during this stage, I was going with something a little on the modern side for her clothing. But then when I started looking up reference for dresses and what I might want to do, I started looking up retro dresses, and I found this dress here from Sidewalk, a company I hadn't heard of until I found this, and I decided to use that dress in the piece. Again, as we've discussed in the past, reference is important. And I find that when it comes to modern fashion or period fashion, or just actually kind of fashion in general, looking up reference is the best way, not the most, but the best way to actually get it right. Because especially artists, most of us aren't fashion forward or fashion backward or fashion anything. So what you want to do is try to find reputable blogs or websites or fashion, sort of like fashion shows and things like that, and use that as your basis for figuring out fashion. My friend Ryan Hall and I always used to talk about how in comic books, especially in the 90s, like people wore the absolute worst clothes because the clothes weren't at all something that the artist was focused on nailing, because their job was to do like a superhero story and make that as exciting as possible. So then when you would see like the X-Men out of their superhero uniforms, they would have like the most atrocious clothes on, because it was just like whatever was simple that would get the job done. And I think that type of a mentality actually is pretty consistent across a lot of different art forms, meaning art forms that we would see in pop culture. So you see a lot more consideration to clothing, obviously, when you get into things like costume design or character design, or things like just lots of concept art for products, especially products that have to exist in a modern world. And when you see that the artists haven't used reference or followed any type of trends, you can totally tell, because everybody suddenly feels less interesting or less current. Now, it's kind of funny to hear me say less current, and I'm here doing a retro dress, but there are aspects of this that make it a little bit less retro. Her hair is more modern, her jewelry is more modern, and so, I mean, that's really it, because otherwise she's a woman. So there's nothing about like her that denotes a time period other than what she adorns herself with. I could have made it even more modern by doing stuff like throwing tattoos on her or putting crazier jewelry, but I kind of wanted to keep this one a little more restrained, just because it felt like a nicer, easier, sort of just relaxed image than if I were to go overboard trying to put a bunch of sort of extra bullshit on it, basically. So let's get into some of the technical stuff. I'm using the symmetry tool which you can find in the canvas section in the top left of Procreate. There's something called Drawing Assist, and when you turn that on, you can set the parameters of that assist. So you can make it either symmetry left and right, you can change where that line is, you can also do like quadrants and I think like split into eighths. So you can do a number of things there. You can even do some perspective stuff, and so it's really powerful if you know how to use it, and really you're only going to mostly know how to use that from experimenting, so I recommend experimenting with that. The rough sketch for this was done with the fat pencil, which is linked down below, and the coloring is done with the turpentine brush. With this particular one, so with the turpentine brush in general, I've been getting a lot more into the idea of using the brush and using the brush's ability to smear, to kind of smear a little bit, but then also using the smudge tool to soften things even further. And then depending on the piece, I don't think I really do it in this one, but in some other future pieces, I'm also incorporating the airbrush to soften some things a little bit more. So as much as I love the brushiness of the turpentine brush, there are times where I just really need to, let that like relax a bit, and as much as I'd like to try and capture that with the turpentine brush, there are times where it's just going to be noisy or messy or something I'm just not looking for. So I've been using softer brushes to try and achieve that. Now, there are absolutely times where doing perfect symmetry across the entire piece is something you want to do. There's no right or wrong in art, but for me, one of the things that's best to do a lot of the time with symmetry is you use the symmetry tool to get that symmetry where you want it, and then you find opportunities to make it asymmetrical. In this one, it's really pronounced because she has this big asymmetrical haircut. But there's also things like when we get to the hands, there's one hand on top of the other, and actually that might be the only two differences. Oh, and then the jewelry, the bracelet on her wrist and the necklace is also asymmetrical. So those are some little touches that make things asymmetrical and bring a little bit more interest, so that something doesn't feel like it's as computer generated or as measured or just artificial, is really what you're trying to avoid there. In a few videos from now, because I just finished the piece last night, I did a Village Corrupted character, and the entire thing is done with the symmetry tool, and then there's much larger deviations from the symmetry tool in that piece, and I think you guys will dig that, and so we'll get more into the symmetry tool on that video. This one's nice and simple though. I feel like I don't have to thoroughly explain the symmetry tool if you haven't used it. And again, I just want to encourage you to go in, try it, start messing around with it, and then when we get to that other video I was talking about, we'll dive in deeper on that. So you can see here my layer stack is actually kind of strange, to be honest, because the dress layer is on top of the skin layer, and that would make absolute sense, I think, if it wasn't for the fact that her chest is under the dress, but then her arms and hands go over the dress, which just makes it a little complicated if you are following the type of layer structure that I follow. So what I did was I just used the arms as a selection and erased away from the dress, as well as the hand. You can see here I made the background red. That's just so that I can see the difference between the dress and the white background that was originally there. Since the dress is so light, it's kind of hard to spot those gaps where the brush was missing and there was some transparency and the background was showing through. Since I wasn't sure what color the background was going to be, I wanted to just make sure I closed all those gaps so that there wasn't a situation where I made the background like a bright purple or a pink or something, or this red like it is right now, and I didn't have those gaps covered. So right now it's just me going in and noodling around and making sure that dress was completely filled in, and then we make the background this bright yellow. This sort of desaturated bright yellow, and this is really the vibe for the background that we go through all the way to the end. Now I'm just adding that piping, that like black piping that's on the dress. And the piece overall is really simple. As I stated before, I wanted something that was just kind of easy and it just kind of had room to breathe and was simple to digest. And the layer stack is also fairly simple, but there's just a couple of little quirks. Like usual, I've got her face, which includes her ears, on a layer, and then under that layer is her body, which includes her neck, chest, shoulders, arms, but then it includes the hand that's under the other hand, but the top hand is on its own layer. Then we've got the dress that's on top of sort of all of that. We have the hair split into 3 layers right now. We have the main mass that's on the top, and then we have another mass that represents the hair going behind her head and behind her neck, and that is on a layer underneath everything. And then we have the layer for her braids, and then actually technically there's one more layer, which is her eyebrows. It's just all sort of separated like that. And if we're counting all hair, her eyebrows are on another, her eyelashes are on another layer too, but I don't really count that when I'm figuring out like my hair layer stack. So that's the way all that is, and then everything else kind of follows the pattern you would expect. Like the black piping is on top of the dress, and the eyes and mouth and stuff are on top of the face, and that type of a thing. So eventually here we're going to move on to, oh yeah, the jewelry's already begun. One thing I have to say is when I'm doing the video for these, the image that I have of the recording is like so much smaller than what you guys eventually watch it at. So sometimes there's like little things happening on the screen and I can't even perceive them. But we'll get there. We'll find success. So when you're doing the flatting process, you want to keep materials in mind, but you're obviously not representing materials too much in the flats. So I kept in mind here that what I wanted for the necklace and the bracelet was that the black parts were almost like hematite, not like lighter like that, but just basically black and shiny is what I was going for. And that there would also be these like gold stars mixed in with the black stars, and that the whole thing would be just shiny so it would catch the light. Sometimes I like to think of the practicality of this person in the real world, and I think that with this otherwise matte dress, it'd be cool to have like some interest around the neck or around the wrist, and the light would catch it, and that would probably be something she'd be going for. Trying to get in the head of the character, you know what I mean? As for the shadows on this one, I went with a different strategy than I have on some of the more recent stuff. You usually see me use a multiply layer with a color, where the shadow then has some quality of color. With this one, I wanted to go with a completely desaturated shadow. There's a couple of ways that you can do this. If it has 0 desaturation, you can either go with, if it has 0 saturation, you can either go with like a black layer and then just lower the opacity down to 20, 30, 40, 50, depending on how intense you want that to be. You can also go with a gray value and then set that to multiply, and it'll essentially do the same thing. So your gray will be the equivalent of your opacity, except in reverse. No, not in reverse. Well, in reverse. It depends on how you think about it. The gray going darker to black will obviously be darker, just like a black layer set with higher opacity will be darker. You can figure it out. It's not rocket science, but the idea there is that it's completely desaturated, so we're not playing with color much in the shadows, which is going to keep a visually simpler, sort of more standard image, which sometimes is exactly what you want to go for depending on what you want the image to be focusing on. And that was sort of the vibe that I thought would be cool for this. I've used completely desaturated shadows in the past. If you go back through like way older stuff especially, there was a time where I was using it a lot, but I just have been bringing it back in certain ways, and I use it a lot when I'm doing like the Village Corrupted stuff has desaturated shadows when I use shadows, which I almost never do in the Village Corrupted pieces. And then I'll also use desaturated shadows almost as like an accent shadow at times. Accent shadow, that's not even like a real thing, but what I mean is like if you've already gone through and painted the entire thing and you've got all these shadows at play, but you want to bring something just a little bit darker and you don't want to add more color complication, then I will use just like a black and lower the opacity. A couple of things I want to point out while we're looking at the whole figure. You can see I'm starting to work on the dress. I wanted the dress to be super soft, and that's really all there is to say about that, meaning soft in the lighting. But the one thing I want to point out is the other opportunities for asymmetry is in lighting. She is mostly lit from top down, or she is lit from top down, I should say. But then like the highlight in her eyes is asymmetrical, because sometimes if you make that symmetrical, it can also make them look very bizarre, because it is kind of rare for that to really land that way. Like she might have a shine coming from a distance that's making that glint in her eye, but then the light that's coming straight down isn't what's doing that, and so that wouldn't be symmetrical as well. That also is an interesting thing about this piece overall, is painting in symmetry on top of the drawing in symmetry. I think drawing in symmetry is, at least for me, is just like easy and it's a no-brainer. And painting is also technically easy, but it's just like a different commitment. So going in and making each layer symmetrical and knowing that you're working that way, I think is just a interesting dynamic, I guess. So with the dress, there was lots of softening that went into the lighting, because the dress and her body shape in this particular dress doesn't have much like sort of hard edges. So it was all about trying to capture the softness of the turns of her form, whereas like on her arms or on her chin or her nose or something like that, you're going to get much harder edges. Same thing with the ears. And so that was the thought process, I guess, around trying to really use like the smudge tool and the way the brush works and all that kind of stuff to really nail the softness of the dress, the softness of the form, I should say. Okay, so now we're on the part where we're doing the shadows on the hair. There was a period in that last little section that I couldn't actually tell what was happening in the piece. It might have been in the braids, but I can't really remember, and I couldn't perceive it, so I just left it sort of full body and see if you guys could find it. And then there's us wrapping up the hair for that like core shadow, or not core shadow, that direct shadow that we've got there. So now we're starting on some softer shadows, doing some very, very light ambient occlusion type stuff, trying to get some extra soft darkening in some of the shadows, as well as trying to get more definition into like the nose and the mouth, because as it stands right now, we've got that one shadow that's basically just highlighting the underside of the nose and the cast off of the nose. Now we can actually use the second shadow to go in and get the nostrils and get some of that geometry a little bit clearer in there. Same thing with the ear and stuff, as you saw. Here we're going to start seeing some softer shadows pop up like under the arms and the hands and some other areas. Sometimes there's a lot of massaging that goes into getting this look right. One thing that's interesting about the turpentine brush is because it pulls the paint, and it's using the information from the layer you're on, and despite masks, like masks sort of have nothing to do with it, when you're pulling off, you can actually pull like zero paint into the paint, because you're pulling it from like outside of the area. And so that's where, when you'll see sometimes in the shadows that are like dark, and then all of a sudden you'll see like the shadow will almost like disappear for a second. You'll see like a streak of that, and that's why sometimes you got to be careful with where you're painting, because you can basically pull no paint into your paint. It's probably a bit weird of a description, but I think if you mess around with it a bunch, you'll totally get it. So now let's zoom in here and do some highlights. We're going to bring some highlights into the necklace and into lips and things, just bringing not so much the high highs of like what you see in the eyes, but just something to bring a little bit more attention, to try and sell the material a little bit more, and to emphasize the shape a little bit more. By putting that accent on there, it sort of pushes that forward a bit, which is nice. Also something that I didn't originally intend to do, but then I decided to do later, was to add a higher value on the skin. So we do that right here. And so I wasn't going to do that. I wanted to keep everything like pretty like flat and matte, but I thought this would be nice to just drive a little bit more shape into the face, and then I do a little bit in the body, but really it's about trying to sell the face more than anything. Get a little bit more detail on the hands as well. So now we're just going to work on the background, adding texture to the backdrop. All I do is basically sample the color that's already there and then go like a little bit brighter with it and then put some energy into the background. Some of it fits the form and others is just sort of random, or maybe not random, but just following my intuition, I guess. And then I put a black outline around her with the intention to lower the opacity on it quite a bit, just to create this nice little soft sort of dark shadowing around her. One thing you'll see in a second though is that's all going to disappear because I accidentally put it all on the same layer, and so I sort of try to monkey around with it to get it where I need it to be. And now you can see me here reapplying some of the messiness, some of the texture and the noise and the energy in the background because I had all that other work sort of lowered in opacity. Okay, now I'm just doing like a bunch of little tweaky things that you could see sort of happen if you were looking at it really intensely. Now we're going to add just some of the last minute details that we forgot, details in the hand, like the thumbnail, and then we're going to actually put a ring on the finger because I thought that that would just add one little bit extra touch. Oh, here's some bounce light, by the way, from the dress onto those buttons, which was just done by sampling the dress color, painting it in, lowering the opacity. And you can see here I originally wanted it to be a silver ring, but I decided to make it gold because it just fit the theming of everything else that was going on a little bit better. So now that that's been added, it's actually on the topmost layer because that makes it easiest for me to then affect the shadow layers underneath. So I just sort of paint that in, select it, delete it, start doing the work around it, that type of thing. And I decided I wanted it to be a colorless stone just to make it a little more neutral and kind of a little classy, you could say. So it's basically just the picking up the highlight that like her eye would pick up and then picking up some of the reflection from her dress. Then we just switch it to gold, but we keep the gem basically the way it is because it was all done with transparencies and stuff. So some last minute touches on the skin just to add some variation, and that will wrap up the illustration right there. So I hope you enjoyed this one. It's a much simpler piece than some of the last few, and it's a simpler piece than some of the next ones, but I just thought that it would be cool to do something like a little softer and more pleasant and a little bit easier, both on my end and on sort of like the viewer end. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you on the next one. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.